A flame that refused to fade, hiding something dark. Welcome to Mystery Sherlock. I am your host, Edward Sterling. Share your location in the comments. I always read them. Now into the shadows. In placing upon record the singular events of the affair, which in my private memoranda I have long described as the case of the candle that would not die, I am confronted by a difficulty not uncommon in those experiences which I shared with my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. There are mysteries which begin with violence, with cries in the night, with the clash of steel or the crack of a pistol. There are others, subtler and more sinister, which steal upon one under the guise of something almost trivial. This case belonged to the latter class. It commenced, so far as I was concerned, not with a corpse, but with a candle. It was in the autumn of 1894, during one of those melancholy London evenings when the yellow fog presses at the windows like a living thing, that I found myself once more in the old rooms at Baker Street. My marriage had by then entered upon one of those practical intervals when a medical man is able, without reproach, to reclaim for a few hours the companionship of his bachelor days. And as Holmes had sent round a brief note begging me to call if I were at liberty, I made my way after dinner through the lamplit streets to that familiar door. Mrs. Hudson admitted me with the indulgent smile which my irregular returns to Baker Street always provoked in her. "Mr. Holmes has been waiting for you, doctor," said she. "He has had no supper to speak of, and I do believe he has smoked enough to poison the whole first floor." I found him stretched at length upon the sofa, his long spare frame half lost in a dressing-gown of mouse-coloured silk, while the acrid blue haze from a black clay pipe drifted in ribbons to the ceiling. His eyes were closed, and his fingers joined together over his breast in that attitude of cat-like repose which with him so often masked the highest mental activity. Upon the table beside him lay the Persian slipper of tobacco, the chemical corner was in ruinous disorder, and the violin rested open upon a chair, as if abandoned in the midst of some caprice. Without opening his eyes, he remarked, "You have come in a hansom, Watson, and have left your umbrella in it." I laughed as I removed my gloves. "You are absurdly wrong in the second particular, Holmes, for here is the umbrella in my hand." He opened one eye languidly and looked at me. "Dear me, so it is."
"Aye, then let us say, rather, that you very nearly left it behind and only recovered it because the driver called after you. He was a civil fellow with a hoarse voice. Your hansom came from the Paddington side, and you have seen 2 patients since 6 o'clock, one of them a child." This was so exact that I could but stare. "You improve with practice," said I, "but I confess that I do not see how the umbrella, of all things, should tell you that I nearly lost it." "My dear Watson, your medical attainments have always lain somewhat ahead of your powers of observation. The ferrule of the umbrella is newly scratched, but not by use. It has been dragged for a yard or 2 upon the roadway before being recovered. The scratch is fresh and still bright. As to the hansom,
The left cuff of your coat is flecked with mud at precisely the height which a wheel would throw from the near side in passing another cab. The mud is of the pale, gritty sort, common west of Edgware Road, and unlike the black, greasy deposit of the city. The horse driver called after you because your right glove is half unbuttoned, done in haste while turning back. And the child, Watson, the child is written upon you in chalk. I looked down, and there indeed upon the sleeve of my coat was a faint white smear. "A nursery slate," said Holmes, "not schoolroom chalk, which is of a coarser grain. You have been reassuring a mother. The second patient was elderly and prosperous, for you smell faintly of strong Madeira, Which no young man keeps in his sick room unless it has been ordered by an older relative who believes in port wine and tradition." I threw myself into the armchair amid my laughter and applause. "It is a mercy, Holmes, that crime is not a necessary ingredient in every human transaction. Otherwise, no man in London would be safe from your analysis." "No man is safe from it," said he. "Only most men are too dull to perceive the danger. But you arrive opportunely, for we have before us, I believe, a problem of some delicacy." He rose at last and handed me a note from the mantelpiece. It was written upon heavy cream paper with a bold, educated hand. "Mr. Josiah Amberley Fenwick, of Fenwick and Loams, Solicitors, Bishopsgate, requests the honour of a few moments' consultation with Mr. Sherlock Holmes in a matter of the gravest private importance. He will call at 8:30 this evening." "Solicitor?" said I, glancing at the clock. "Then he is expected momentarily." Holmes nodded. "A man of means, good position, and, unless I am very much deceived, a prey to acute fear. He has already called once today in my absence, left that note, and returned to his chambers only to come back at the appointed hour. Our visitor, Watson, is punctual by training and agitated by circumstance." "What makes you say that he has already called?" Holmes pointed with his pipe stem to the hearthrug. "There are two sets of impressions from the same boots. The first are dry, the second damp at the edges. Observe also the ash in the tray beside the inkstand. It is not my tobacco. It is from a Trichinopoly cigar, half-smoked and crushed with unnecessary violence. A composed man does not waste such an abomination twice in one day." At that instant there came the sound of measured steps upon the stair, firm enough to suggest self-command, yet with a certain hurried emphasis which betrayed an effort rather than a habit. A moment later Mrs. Hudson announced Mr. Josiah Amberley Fenwick. He was a man of 50 or thereabouts, broad in the shoulder, deep in the chest, and of that compact, well-nourished type which speaks of prosperity more convincingly than any jewel or garment. His face, however, was of a pallor so unhealthy as to strike one at once. It was not the pallor of illness, but of inward strain. The clean-shaven jaw was square and forceful, the mouth sensitive to the verge of weakness, and the eyes grey, prominent, and ringed with sleeplessness, had the fixed brightness which I have most often seen in those who are sustained beyond their natural power by anxiety alone. He carried a silk hat in one hand, and in the other an object which he set very carefully upon Holmes's table before taking his seat. It was a brass candlestick, old-fashioned and somewhat ornate, with a guttered white candle still fixed in the socket. I observed that Holmes's attention, which no detail ever escaped, was instantly directed not to the man, but to the candle. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" asked the visitor. "I am. This is my intimate friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, upon whose discretion you may rely, as upon my own. Pray be seated, Mr. Fenwick." The solicitor bowed stiffly in my direction and sat, though rather on the edge of the chair than at ease within it. "You may think me foolish, Mr. Holmes," said he, "or fanciful, or unfit for your time. God knows I have asked myself as much a dozen times this day, yet there are certain facts which no sane man can ignore when they accumulate beyond coincidence." "You interest me already," said Holmes. Mr. Fenwick moistened his lips. 3 nights ago my elder brother, Elias Fenwick, was found dead in the library of our family house at Stoke Marston, in Surrey. "My dear sir!" I exclaimed. He inclined his head gravely. "The matter has been placed officially under the care of the local police, who see no difficulty in it. Our family doctor certifies failure of the heart accelerated by shock. My brother had a weak heart. He was alone. The room was locked upon the inside, and there were no marks of violence." Holmes leaned back, his fingertips together. "And then where lies the mystery?" The man's hand shook as he pointed to the candle upon the table. In that, Holmes remained silent. "My brother," continued Fenwick, "had been dead, according to the doctor, for some 3 hours when the servants forced an entrance shortly after 1 in the morning. Yet this candle," he touched it with an almost superstitious reluctance, "was still burning when they entered, though it had been lit before 10 o'clock. "That is remarkable," said I. "It is impossible," cried Fenwick. "At least, it should be impossible. My brother was methodical to excess. He always used the same candles in the library, a particular household stock ordered by the box from a chandler in Holborn. We tested one of the same batch yesterday. It burns for somewhat less than 2 hours, yet this one had burned more than 3. Ordum was not exhausted even then." Holmes rose, lifted the candlestick, and held it beneath the lamp. The dead white tallow had run in twisted sheets and hardened upon the brass. Near the base there was a faint brown discoloration, and upon one side a long smear as though it had been handled before the wax had cooled. "Was the window open?" Holmes asked. "No." "The fire lit?" "A small one, low in the grate." "No signs of intrusion? No papers disturbed? No valuables missing?" "None." "And your brother's position?" "He was seated in his chair by the writing table, his head turned a little to one side, his right hand upon the chair arm, and his left lying across his breast. There was, I am told, an expression of extreme terror upon his face." Holmes's eyes flashed for an instant. "Ah!" "The police," said Fenwick bitterly. "Do you have made much of that expression and nothing at all of the candle? They say a man may die in fear of many things. They speak of a nightmare, of an attack, of some private agitation, but there is more, much more. Last night, in that same room, another candle of the same kind was set by the servants, merely because the household had become uneasy, and all the lamps in the corridor were lit. This morning it was found still burning after dawn." For the first time Holmes started visibly. "Indeed?" "Yes. And this time the library had been kept locked and the key left outside with the butler." Holmes set the candlestick down very gently. "Have you brought me the second candle?" "No, it remains at the house. But this was the candle beside my brother when he died." There was a pause. Outside, but the wind pressed against the panes, and somewhere in the depths of Baker Street a carriage rolled by with a muffled clatter upon the wet stones. Holmes stood with bowed head, his thin fingers drumming once upon the mantel, then becoming still. "You have omitted something, Mr. Fenwick," said he at last. The solicitor gave a violent start. "Omitted?" "Yes. Something which to you is disagreeable, perhaps compromising, yet which bears upon your brother's death. It concerns a quarrel." The man's face darkened in a flush that rose from neck to brow. "I see that your reputation is deserved, Mr. Holmes." "Yes, we had words that evening." "About money?" "About a woman." Holmes glanced swiftly at me, then back. "Be good enough to tell me everything." Mr. Fenwick passed his hand over his brow. His composure, already strained, it seemed for an instant near collapse. "It is a miserable family business, and I had hoped—" He checked himself. "No matter. Since my brother is dead, concealment would be both cowardly and useless. The woman in question is my niece, his daughter, Miss Clara Fenwick. She disappeared from the house 6 weeks ago and has not since communicated with us." "Disappeared?" said I. "Left without permission, without explanation, and, I regret to say, after keeping company with a person of whom neither my brother nor I could approve. Elias held me partly responsible because the young lady had once appealed to me for leniency. Harsh words passed between us. The servants heard some portion of them. That, no doubt, is why the local inspector already eyes me with a suspicion which he is too polite to express. And yet you come here, placing in my hands the very object which you conceive to be central to the mystery," said Holmes. That speaks well for your innocence, Mr. Fenwick, or for your intelligence." The solicitor rose halfway from his chair. "Mr. Holmes, I do not ask you to spare me. I ask only that you discover the truth. If my brother died naturally, then let us bury him in peace. But if there was another hand in it, if there is some infernal contrivance at work in that house, then I swear to you that I shall not rest until it is exposed." Holmes had resumed his seat, and now closed his eyes once more in that curious fashion which with him meant not disengagement, but the keenest concentration. "You will return to Stoke Marston tonight?" "Immediately after this interview." "Very good. We shall join you by the first train in the morning." The man drew a deep breath, as though some portion of his burden had shifted. "You will come?" "My dear sir," said Holmes, opening his eyes and smiling with that cold eagerness which the prospect of a worthy problem always brought into his face, "when a candle burns longer than nature permits beside a dead man in a locked room, I should regard it as a personal affront were I not allowed to examine the wick." When Mr. Fenwick had at last departed, Holmes remained silent until the echo of the closing door had died upon the stairs. Then he took up the candlestick once more and sniffed delicately at the wax. "Well, Watson," said he, "what do you make of our deathless candle?" "I make of it," said I, "that either the Chandler of Holborn has supplied an extraordinary article,
or else our solicitor is the victim of some grotesque misunderstanding." Holmes's smile was faint, but unmistakable. "An excellent beginning. You have stated the alternatives, and one of them is impossible. Therefore the other, however grotesque, must contain the truth." He bent lower over the candle, and I noticed then a peculiar expression in his face. Not triumph, not amusement, but that fine, eager alertness which told me some tiny and significant detail had already presented itself to his mind. Yet when I pressed him, he would say no more. "Tomorrow, my dear Watson," said he. "The fog is thick, the game is afoot, and the dead man's candle is not the only thing in this affair which has burned longer than it should." He set the brass stick carefully upon the corner of the table, drew his violin to him, and
while the London mist coiled ever more densely against the windows of Baker Street, began to play one of those low, wandering airs which were with him both meditation and prophecy. And so began a case which was to lead us from a quiet Surrey house to the black heart of an old deception, and to show me once again that there are few things more dangerous in this world than a simple fact which refuses to behave as it ought. I have observed that there are few experiences more stimulating to the mind than the quiet interval which follows the acceptance of a curious case. Holmes, when once engaged, was never idle in thought, though to the casual observer he might appear languid or even indifferent. That night, however, I could detect beneath his outward calm a current of intense activity. He played for perhaps half an hour. He then suddenly laid the violin aside and sprang to his feet with a briskness which was always the herald of action. "Come, Watson," said he, "we must not allow our worthy solicitor to suppose that we are content to sleep upon so singular a problem. There are certain preliminary inquiries which admit of no delay." "At this hour?" I asked, glancing at the clock, which pointed to 9:15. "Especially at this hour. The night has a way of loosening tongues, which remain obstinately tied during the day. Pray fetch your hat." Within a few minutes we were once more in the fog-laden street, a hansom bearing us eastward through the thickening gloom. Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers steepled, his eyes fixed upon the shifting blur beyond the cab window. "You observed the candle, Watson?" I did. It appeared to me quite ordinary. Precisely. And yet it is not. Therein lies the interest. Nature is consistent. When an object behaves inconsistently, it is either misinterpreted or tampered with. In this instance, we may safely discard the former. You believe, then, that the candle has been altered? Holmes gave a slight nod. In some fashion, yes, but alteration alone does not explain the circumstances of death. A man does not expire of heart failure merely because a candle burns longer than expected. There must be a relation between the two events. Subtle, perhaps, but definite? And the locked room? A device, possibly, or a coincidence. Locked rooms, my dear Watson, are the refuge of unimaginative criminals and over-imaginative observers alike, and they are rarely so secure as they appear. Our cab drew up at last before a narrow frontage in a busier thoroughfare, where a faded sign bore the name of a chandler. The hour was late, yet a dim light still glowed within. Holmes alighted at once and rapped briskly upon the glass. After some delay, the door was opened by a small, elderly man in shirt-sleeves, whose suspicious expression softened into curiosity at the sight of two well-dressed visitors at such an hour. "Mr. Chalmers," said Holmes. "The same, sir, though we are closed for the night." "A moment only. We are upon a matter of some urgency. You supply candles to a Mr. Elias Fenwick of Stoke Marston?" The man scratched his chin. "Fenwick? Ah, yes. Regular order, boxed and delivered. Good quality tallow, sir. No complaints, I trust?" "On the contrary," said Holmes mildly, "we are here because of a most remarkable property which your candles appear to possess." The chandler blinked. "Remarkable, sir?" Holmes produced the candle from beneath his coat and held it up. "Do you recognize this?" The man took it, turning it in his fingers. "One of mine, to be sure. Same mould, same finish, I'd swear to it." "And how long would such a candle burn under ordinary conditions?" "An hour and 3/4, maybe 2 if the wick's well set." Holmes inclined his head. "And if it were to burn for 3 hours or more?" The chandler gave a short laugh. "Then it wouldn't be one of mine, sir." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Exactly." We left the shop a few minutes later, Holmes having extracted from the bewildered Mr. Chalmers every detail of his manufacture, supply, and clientele. As we resumed our journey, I turned to him with renewed interest. "You are satisfied, then, that the candle has been tampered with?" "Entirely. The question now is how, and to what end." "And you believe that answer lies at Stoke Marston?" "Undoubtedly. But there is another thread which we must not neglect." "You refer to the niece?" Holmes gave a slight smile. "You grow perceptive, Watson. Yes, Miss Clara Fenwick is an element of considerable importance. A young woman disappears under questionable circumstances. Her father dies in apparent terror. And a phenomenon, half mechanical and half theatrical, presents itself at the scene. These facts are not isolated." Our cab turned westward once more, and within half an hour we were back at Baker Street. Holmes wasted no time in rest, but instead drew his writing materials toward him and dashed off a series of rapid notes, which he sealed and addressed with equal speed. "Telegram to the Surrey Constabulary," said he, tossing one aside. "Inquiry to a certain agency in the Strand. And, this is of particular interest, an old acquaintance of mine who has more than once been useful in tracing persons who prefer not to be found." "You anticipate that Miss Fenwick may yet be discovered?" "I anticipate nothing. I prepare for everything." At last, a little before midnight, he threw himself into his chair with a sigh of satisfaction. "We have done what may be done in advance. Tomorrow we go to the scene itself, and there, I think, we shall find that our candle is not merely an object, but a message." "A message?" I repeated. Holmes closed his eyes. "Yes. And like all messages, and it was meant to be read, though not perhaps by the police of Surrey." I could obtain no further explanation from him, and soon after retired to my room, though not to immediate sleep. My mind was filled with the image of that guttered candle burning on beside the dead man in the silent library, defying both time and reason. It seemed to me, as I lay wakeful in the darkness, that we were not dealing with a simple death, nor even with a cleverly contrived deception, but with something more deliberate, something staged. And if it were indeed a performance, then the question which pressed most urgently upon my mind was this: for whom had it been intended? It was still dark when I awoke, though the quality of the silence had changed in that subtle fashion which precedes the dawn. I found Holmes already dressed and standing by the window, but his long figure outlined against the pale grey light which filtered through the thinning fog. He turned at once as I entered. "You are punctual, Watson? Excellent. Our train leaves in 40 minutes, and I have no desire to keep Mr. Fenwick waiting in his present state of agitation." We took a hurried breakfast, during which Holmes spoke little, though I observed that he read once more the note from our client and examined with minute attention the hardened wax upon the candle we had brought with us. At last, with a decisive gesture, he wrapped it carefully and placed it in his pocket. "The thing has spoken," said he quietly. "We shall see whether the house corroborates its testimony." Our journey to Surrey was accomplished without incident, save that Holmes spent the greater part of it in profound thought, his eyes closed and his fingers occasionally tapping upon his knee in a slow, rhythmic fashion. Once or twice he murmured a word or two: timing, residue, intention. But when I sought clarification, he merely waved me to silence. At the small country station nearest Stoke Marston we found Mr. Fenwick awaiting us, his appearance, if anything, more haggard than on the previous evening. He greeted us with restrained eagerness and ushered us at once into a waiting dog-cart. "You have come quickly, Mr. Holmes. I am grateful, more grateful than I can express." "We shall see if gratitude is warranted," said Holmes. "You have allowed nothing to be disturbed in the library?" "Nothing. The room remains as it was found, save that the body has been removed." "Very good. And the second candle?" "Still in its place. She was discovered this morning." Holmes nodded, and we drove on in silence through a stretch of quiet countryside where the hedgerows were still heavy with mist and the fields lay colourless beneath the waning night. Presently the house came into view, a solid, square-built structure of brick, set back from the road and flanked by a neglected garden whose tangled growth suggested more attention to business than to beauty. As we alighted, I observed Holmes cast a swift glance over the facade, noting, as I knew he would, the arrangement of the windows, the position of the chimneys, and the general aspect of the building. There was nothing outwardly remarkable in it. Yet I felt, as I crossed the threshold, that curious sense of oppression which certain houses convey, as though they held within them an atmosphere of events not wholly at rest. How we were received by a grave and elderly butler, who conducted us without delay to the library. Mr. Fenwick paused at the door. "I have not entered since last night," said he. "I thought it best that you should see it untouched." Holmes inclined his head. "You have done wisely." The door was unlocked, and we passed within. It was a long, low room, lined on three sides with books and furnished in a heavy, somewhat antiquated fashion. A writing table stood near the centre, and beside it a large armchair, now empty. The curtains were half drawn, admitting a dull and uncertain light, and upon the table, exactly as described, stood a brass candlestick with its candle still burning, though now reduced to a mere stub, its flames small and flickering. I confess that I started at the sight. "It has burned all night," whispered Fenwick hoarsely. but Holmes made no reply. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and bent over the candle, his face intent, his nostrils slightly dilated as though he detected some faint odour invisible to us. "Do not approach," said he suddenly, raising a hand. We halted at once. Holmes remained motionless for several seconds, then very delicately passed his fingers through the air above the flame, as if testing something beyond mere heat. At last he straightened and turned to us, his expression grave. "Yes," said he softly. "It is as I thought. The candle is not merely an anomaly, it is an instrument." "An instrument?" I echoed. "Of death," said Holmes. Mr. Fenwick uttered a broken exclamation. "But how?" Holmes held up his hand. "Not yet. There are still links to be forged, but I may say this much. Your brother did not die of natural causes. And the explanation of that fact lies not in what we see, but in what we cannot." He moved then toward the chair in which the unfortunate Elias Fenwick had met his end, his keen eyes sweeping every inch of the carpet, the table, and the surrounding space. "Come, Watson," said he quietly. "The room has spoken once. Let us see what more it has to tell." Holmes's manner, when once he had declared the candle to be an instrument of death, underwent that subtle transformation which I had learned to associate with the tightening of his intellectual grip upon a problem. The languor was gone. In its place there appeared a cold precision of movement and an economy of speech which admitted of no interruption. He drew from his pocket a small lens and a folding measure, and dropping to one knee beside the armchair, began a minute inspection of the immediate surroundings. I took up a position somewhat behind him, careful not to disturb the scene, while Mr. Fenwick remained near the door, his agitation such that he could scarcely keep still. "You observe, Watson," said Holmes at length without looking up, "that the chair is drawn slightly back from the table. No more than 2 inches, yet sufficient to indicate that the occupant shifted his position shortly before death." "It might have been accidental," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "No, the displacement is too deliberate. The marks of the chair legs upon the carpet are distinct, and there is a second, fainter impression nearer the table." He moved once, and then again. "From discomfort?" "From perception," said Holmes quietly. He rose and turned his attention to the writing table. A sheet of paper lay upon it, blank save for a single line of figures hastily scrawled near the top. Holmes bent over it, his brows contracting. "Curious," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. "A sequence, 372, and then it breaks off. Written with increasing pressure, as you see. The last figure is almost gouged into the paper, a man in extremis, Watson, attempting to record something of importance. A clue to his murderer? Possibly. Or to the means by which he was attacked." He held the paper up to the light, then set it carefully aside and turned once more to the candlestick. Taking out his pocket-knife, he scraped a minute fragment of the hardened wax from its side and examined it closely. "You perceive the discoloration here?" said he, indicating the faint, brownish stain near the base.
I do. It is not the result of ordinary burning, nor is it accidental. There is an admixture, something introduced into the candle itself." "A poison?" I ventured. Holmes glanced at me with approval. "An excellent hypothesis, but a poison which acts through what medium? Not ingestion, for the man did not eat the candle, not contact, for there are no burns or lesions upon the hands. We must therefore consider the third avenue." "The air," said I. "Precisely." Mr. Fenwick uttered a low cry. "You mean that he was, what, suffocated?" "Not suffocated, something more insidious. Consider, Watson, a candle burns, and in burning it consumes oxygen and produces vapours."
"And if those vapours were altered, If they carried with them some subtle agent, then a man seated within their influence might be affected without the slightest external sign. I felt a chill run through me. "But surely," said I, "such a contrivance would require knowledge, scientific knowledge of a high order." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, and that, I think, is our first solid step. We are no longer dealing with accident, nor with crude violence, but with design, intelligent, calculated design." He moved now toward the fireplace, where a small fire had burned low. Kneeling once more, he sifted through the ash with delicate care, extracting at last a tiny, twisted fragment of something blackened and brittle. "A wick end," said he, "but not from this candle. It is shorter, thicker, of a different make." Mr. Fenwick leaned forward. "There was only one candle in the room when my brother died." "So it would appear," said Holmes dryly, "and yet here is evidence of another." He rose and dusted his hands. "Tell me, Mr. Fenwick, who first entered the room when your brother was found?" "The butler and one of the maids. They forced the door together." "And afterward?" "The doctor, myself, and later the local inspector." Holmes nodded slowly. "And none of them remarked upon anything unusual, save the candle?" "Nothing." Holmes walked once more about the room, his gaze sweeping from shelf to shelf, from curtain to carpet, pausing here and there upon some minute detail invisible to my less trained eye. At last he stopped before the window and examined the latch. "Secure," said he. "No tampering. The door was locked, the windows fastened."
And yet a second candle has left its trace. That is significant, very significant." He turned abruptly to Mr. Fenwick. "Your household? How many reside here?" "Myself, the butler, 3 maids, and a groom." "And no visitors of late?" "None since my niece left us." Holmes was silent for a moment. "Then we must suppose," said he at last, "that the person responsible for your brother's death had both access to this room and sufficient knowledge to prepare such an instrument. That narrows our field considerably." "To whom?" asked Fenwick anxiously. Holmes gave a faint smile. "To someone who wished not merely to kill your brother, but to do so in a manner which would suggest something else entirely." "Something else?" "Yes," said Holmes softly. "Fear, for example." He glanced toward the empty chair, and I followed his gaze.
For a moment, I could almost picture the unfortunate Elias Fenwick seated there, his eyes fixed upon the steadily burning candle, watching, waiting, until some unseen force overcame him. "Come, Watson," said Holmes briskly. "We have extracted what we can from the room for the present. The next step lies not in the library, but in the lives of those who inhabited it." "And the figures?" I asked, indicating the paper. Holmes slipped it into his pocket. "Ah, yes, 372, a dying man's last effort at communication. Depend upon it, Watson, those numbers will speak before we are done." Holmes's decision to shift his inquiry from the physical evidence of the room to the human elements of the household marked, as I well knew, a significant turning point in his method. Where another man might have lingered among objects, and Holmes sought always the mind behind them, it was with this purpose that he requested Mr. Fenwick to assemble the servants in the morning room, a smaller chamber adjoining the hall. They entered one by one with that subdued uneasiness which the presence of an investigator is apt to inspire. The butler, a tall, spare man of grave demeanour, stood foremost, while behind him clustered the maids, 2 young, 1 middle-aged, and a broad-shouldered groom, whose sun-reddened face and awkward posture suggested more familiarity with horses than with inquiry. Holmes surveyed them briefly, then seated himself with an air of idle politeness which I knew to be wholly deceptive. "You will oblige me," said he, "by answering a few questions. There is no cause for alarm. I provided that your answers are both truthful and complete. His eyes rested first upon the butler. You were among those who forced the library door? I was, sir. At what hour? A little after 1 in the morning. And the door was locked? Yes, sir. We had to break it. Holmes nodded. You observed the candle? Yes, sir. It was burning on the table. Did you touch it? No, sir. Or move anything in the room? Nothing, sir. Holmes turned to the eldest of the maids. You accompanied the butler? Yes, sir. Did you notice anything unusual, any smell, for example? The woman hesitated. Well, sir, now that you mention it, there was something queer-like in the air. Not strong, but different. I thought it might be the fire. Holmes's eyes sharpened slightly. Describe it. I couldn't rightly, sir. Not smoke, not exactly.
Something sharp, like when you clean metal with spirits. Holmes inclined his head. Thank you, that will do. He dismissed her with a gesture and turned to the others in succession, but elicited little of further value. None had entered the room before the door was forced. None had handled the candle, and none had seen or heard anything to suggest intrusion. Yet I observed that Holmes's attention lingered upon the groom, whose unease seemed greater than the rest. You sleep above the stable? Holmes asked. Yes, sir. On the night in question, did you hear anything unusual? The man shifted his weight. No, sir, nothing at all. Holmes regarded him steadily. You are certain? No sound from the house? No movement in the grounds? The groom hesitated, then shook his head. No, sir. Holmes said nothing more.
Aye, but I saw the faint tightening at the corners of his mouth, which indicated that the answer had not satisfied him. When the servants had withdrawn, Mr. Fenwick turned anxiously toward us. Well, Mr. Holmes? Holmes rose slowly. They have told us what they know, or what they believe they know. The maid's observation is of particular importance. The smell? Precisely. It confirms my suspicion that the candle was not merely altered, but charged with some volatile substance, one which, when heated, produces a vapour capable of affecting the human system. Fenwick passed a trembling hand across his face. Then my brother was poisoned? Through the air he breathed? In effect, yes. But how could such a thing be arranged without detection? Holmes smiled faintly. Because the method is both ingenious and unobtrusive. A candle is the most innocent of objects. It attracts no suspicion. It burns, it melts, it vanishes, and with it the evidence of its own function. And the second candle? I asked. The one found burning this morning? Holmes turned toward me. Watson, that is the more curious point. It suggests repetition. Either the perpetrator returned, or the effect was meant to be demonstrated again. To whom? Said Fenwick, his voice strained. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he crossed to the window and looked out over the grounds, now faintly touched with the first light of morning. That, said he at last, depends upon who was intended to witness it. He turned back suddenly. Tell me, Mr. Fenwick, who had access to your brother's private effects, his study, his papers, his personal correspondence? No one, save himself. And
On occasion, my niece. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Miss Clara again. She was much in his confidence, said Fenwick reluctantly. More so than I. And since her disappearance, have you examined her rooms? Only briefly. There seemed nothing of consequence. Holmes reached for his hat. Then we shall do so now. As we moved toward the door, I could not help but feel that the case, which had begun with a candle, was now narrowing inexorably toward a single figure, one absent, yet increasingly central. And as Holmes stepped into the corridor, his expression keen and intent, I knew that whatever lay hidden in those deserted rooms would bring us closer to the truth or deeper into the deception which surrounded it. The discovery in Miss Clara Fenwick's room proved to be the final thread which, once grasped,
We enabled Holmes to unravel the entire skein of mystery. I shall not dwell at length upon the details of that chamber, though I recall it as orderly, restrained, and bearing little of the frivolity one might expect in a young lady's apartment. There were books, many of them scientific in nature, neatly arranged upon a side table, and a small escritoire whose contents Holmes examined with particular care. It was there that he found what he had anticipated. "A correspondence," said he, holding up a folded letter. "Burned at the edges, but not entirely destroyed. An unfortunate oversight." He read it rapidly, his eyes moving with increasing intensity, and then handed it to me. It was signed with initials only, but its contents were unmistakable. It spoke of experiments, of vapours, of delivery through harmless domestic mediums, and of a demonstration intended to prove both efficacy and discretion. The tone was at once clinical and ambitious, and beneath it I sensed a fervour which bordered upon fanaticism. Holmes turned to Mr. Fenwick. "Your niece, sir, was engaged in chemical study of a rather advanced kind. Did you know this?" Fenwick stared in astonishment. "I was aware that she read widely, but nothing of this nature, nothing so dangerous." "Dangerous indeed," said Holmes, "and not without consequence. This letter, coupled with the evidence in the library, allows us to reconstruct the entire sequence." He began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Miss Clara Fenwick, possessing both intelligence and scientific curiosity, Otis becomes involved, whether independently or under influence, with experimental work involving volatile compounds. She discovers, or believes she discovers, a method by which such compounds may be dispersed through combustion, specifically through a candle. I felt a chill as the full implication settled upon me. "She tests it?" I said. Holmes inclined his head. "Not immediately. There is hesitation, doubt, but circumstances intervene. A disagreement with her father, your brother, leads to her departure from the house. Yet before she goes, she leaves behind certain materials, and perhaps inadvertently the means for their use." Mr. Fenwick sank into a chair. "You mean my brother?" "Was not her intended victim," said Holmes firmly. "On the contrary, I believe he discovered her work and sought to understand it. The figures, 3, 7...
2 are not random. They correspond, I am convinced, to proportions or measurements, part of a formula he was attempting to decipher." "And the candle?" I asked. Holmes stopped. The candle was prepared, whether by Miss Fenwick herself or by another, and placed in the library. When lit, it released a vapour, subtle, odour faintly perceptible, but sufficient to affect a man with a weak heart. The effect would not be immediate, but progressive, producing anxiety, disorientation, and ultimately cardiac failure. "And the locked room?" said I. "A natural consequence. Your brother was alone. The door locked, as was his habit. No intrusion was necessary." Mr. Fenwick raised his head slowly. "But the second candle, the one found burning this morning?" Holmes's expression hardened. "That, I think, was no accident."
"Yeah, it was placed there deliberately after your brother's death." "By whom?" Holmes turned toward the door. "By the person who feared that the first demonstration had not been sufficiently understood." At that moment, the butler appeared, pale and agitated. "Sir, there is a lady. She has just arrived. She insists upon seeing Mr. Holmes at once." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Show her in." A moment later, a young woman entered, pale, composed, yet with a tension in her bearing which spoke of suppressed emotion. I recognized her at once from Fenwick's earlier description. "Miss Clara Fenwick," said Holmes quietly. She inclined her head. "You have been expecting me, I think." Holmes regarded her steadily. "I have been expecting someone." She stepped forward. "I learned of my father's death only yesterday."
And of the circumstances. Her voice faltered slightly. "I knew then that I must return." "You knew more than that," said Holmes. "You knew that your work had been used." Her eyes widened. "Used? No, I left everything behind. I abandoned it." "Not entirely," said Holmes. "Someone else understood enough to replicate your method, if imperfectly." She stared at him. "Who?" Holmes's gaze shifted slowly toward Mr. Fenwick. The solicitor recoiled as though struck. "This is monstrous." Holmes's voice was calm but unyielding. "You had motive, resentment, financial pressure, a knowledge of your niece's experiments. You quarreled with your brother that very evening. You had access to the materials, and you alone, among the household."
I possessed both the opportunity and the incentive to stage a second demonstration, one designed to reinforce the illusion of something unnatural. Fenwick's composure collapsed. "It was never meant to kill him," he cried, "only to frighten him, to bring him to reason, to make him see—" "You miscalculated," said Holmes. "The vapor did the rest." There was silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the dying fire. Miss Clara sank into a chair, her face ashen. "I never meant—" "No," said Holmes gently. "But you created the possibility." The rest followed swiftly. The authorities were summoned, and Mr. Fenwick, broken and unresisting, was taken into custody. Whether his act had been one of desperation or calculation, I leave to others to judge. As for Miss Clara, Holmes spoke privately with her before her departure, and I believe that in his own austere fashion he sought to guide her away from the perilous path her talents had begun to trace. As we left Stoke Marston that evening, the shadows lengthening across the quiet fields, I turned to Holmes. "It is a grim conclusion," said I. "On the contrary," he replied, "it is a precise one. The facts align, the chain is complete, and the truth, however unwelcome, stands revealed." "And the candle?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "A simple object, Watson. Yet in the right hands it became a message, a weapon, and a deception all in one. There are few things more dangerous than knowledge applied without wisdom." He drew his coat about him as the chill air deepened. "Come," said he, "we have done with this affair. Let us return to Baker Street. And I find that I have a sudden desire for a very ordinary candle, and the assurance that it will behave exactly as it ought."